Hi there, this is Colin McGarry with Walking D-Day. Now, Ed Shames was another paratrooper who joined up after Pearl Harbour. Now, with the war going on in Europe, he wanted to join the army, but he was too young. But in Canada, they were training pilots as young as 18 years old. So Shames and two friends wanted to join the Royal Canadian Air Force. But Elmer wasn't accepted, and so they didn't go. After Pearl Harbour, he heard they were setting up a special volunteer parachute unit. So he wanted to apply for that, but he was still too young. But he needed his parents' permission. He got. By August 1942, he was at Camp Toccoa with the 506th. They arrived late at night by train, and early in the morning they had roll call, and then a medical test and a mental test. Many were eliminated. They soon had another test. An instructor pointed to the big mound outside the camp. He said that mountain is called Curragh. That means stand alone. You've got an hour and a half to get up to the top and back again. Now Ed did it, even though his legs were burning when the gradient was getting steeper. Many men dropped out during the hard training. In December, they moved to Fort Benning to start parachute training. They had to learn to fold the parachute, then use a 250-foot high crane to practice jumping. Now, the 1st of January 1943, they did their first actual jump from a plane. After 5 jumps, they awarded their wings from Colonel Sink and 2 weeks leave. During a field exercise, Shames and other gun commanders were told to set up machine gun positions to protect the platoon. Ed Shames chose a good site with good visibility and protection from an enemy attack, and then he made maps with overlays showing the platoon and where the guns were. Now, when Wolverton came to see that, he was amazed at the overlay maps that Shames had made, and he asked him to be his operations officer, the S3, and promoted him to sergeant. Captain Carman showed Shames how to make a sand map. Now, the sand was in a big wooden box, 12 foot by 12 foot, and the sand could be shaped to the form of the terrain they were going to jump into. In September, they embarked upon the steamship Samaria and headed to Liverpool. From there, they were taken to the camp at Ramsbury. The officers were billeted in houses with families. Now, Wolverton replaced Captain Carman with Captain Shettle. Now, Shettle and Shames hadn't got on too well before, but now they had to make the best of it. Colonel Wolverton thought he wasn't going to make it through the invasion. He started writing letters to his son, who couldn't even read yet, to be opened on successive birthdays. He showed them to Shames to ask for his opinion on them. Towards the end of May, Shames thought they were prepared for another exercise, but the officers were called to a meeting at Chafe, and without giving details, they were told what to expect, and the battalion commanders were given sealed envelopes. On May the 26th, the camp was sealed in. Shames and his team had made the sand map of the drop zone, and when Wolverton came to see it, he said, "Who put that sign on Carentan church saying avoid at all costs?" Shames said, "Well, I did, because the Chafe notes said that there's probably a German HQ in Carentan." Then Wolverton said to Shames, "Would you like to do the briefing? That'll free up Shettle to do other things." So Shames did the briefing on the jump. Shortly before midnight on the 5th, the 45 C-47s of the 440th Troop Carrier Group took off and headed to France. Now, Shames was supposed to be in Wolverton's plane, but just before they got into the planes, Wolverton told him that a British journalist was going along, and so Shames would have to go in another plane. So now he found himself amongst some strangers in another plane. Now the jump master designated Shames to be the pusher, so he was number 19, and he used to push everybody out to keep the momentum going. Now shortly before they got to the drop zone, the red light went on, and then when they started jumping, Shames was pushing from the back. The man just in front of him stumbled, just a few seconds lost, but that was crucial. In the 2 minutes it took to come down from the plane, Ed could see he was heading towards a burning factory. He landed in amongst a group of cows. He could see a carnation painted on the wall. He realised he was in the Gloria dairy where they made carnation condensed milk. He'd put the sign on the church on the sand map, avoid at all costs, and now he was right in Carentan. So he cut his risers, assembled his M1 and headed to the bassin of flow, or the canal that joins Carentan to the sea. And he crossed over here, where there used to be a swing bridge, and there was a brick factory. You could see the line of trees along the side of the canal, and he decided to stay away from the canal but follow it. Now he met up with some other paratroopers. They avoided one farmhouse, then Shames decided to knock on the door of an isolated house. When the Frenchman opened the door and he explained that the invasion had started, the wife started screaming with shock. Shames put his hand over her mouth till she calmed down, then showed them his map. The farmer didn't think they'd meet any Germans between there and the River Douve. So they set off towards the bridge over the Tourt, and on the way they met two drunken German soldiers tottering along the path. Shames told the men to use their knives on them so as not to use their guns, and he kept one of their Germans' pocketbooks to show Wolverton. He thought that might be useful. Now, thinking the bridge over the Tourt would be guarded, he decided to use the walkway over the lock gate. You see, the bridge over the Tourt was a stone bridge. It's been replaced by a Bailey bridge. This is where the Tourt meets the Douve, and they go to the sea along the canalised part of the Douve, and then there's the canal that comes from Carentan. Now that to cross the Douve, the Shames tied a rope to him round his waist, and he tried to wade across, but he went under. So the men pulled him back, and so they went further down the river, or up the river, I should say, and then they managed to get across. They came upon a 501st captain with 5 men. Shames told him he was Wolverton's operations sergeant and asked if he wanted to take command. The captain said they would follow him for now. Ed was following an easterly bearing, which would lead them to the canal part of the river. Then they met Lieutenant Colonel Johnson of the 501st. He said, "Which way's the goddamn lock?" Shames showed him on the map and indicated the direction to take. The captain and the other 501st men left with Johnson. Shames and his group kept the canal on their right, heading for the bridges. Captain Shettle was already at the bridge and was pleased to see him. Shettle and his men were sheltering by a 10-foot berm with a road on top that led to the road bridge. He explained that as he was the most senior officer present, he would take command until Colonel Wolverton arrived. They didn't know that Colonel Wolverton had been caught in an apple tree on landing and shot. The other officers who could have taken command were either dead, prisoner or lost. So Shettle was going to be the commander for their time at the bridges. He also told them that the radios were out of action. There were about 40 men there, including a German prisoner, who had tagged along with Sergeant Bennett and his group for some time before they realised who he was. Lieutenant Christensen was organising a team to go and reconnoitre across the road bridge. A Lancaster bomber descended vertically and crashed near the Rats farm. They had been bombing Pointe du Hoc. 30 minutes later, the reconnaissance team set off across the bridge. De Carlo was badly wounded and had to get himself back across the bridge by using a plank and sliding across the supporting structure. Sergeant Stan Stockins had exceptional strength and was throwing half-pound balls of C2 across the canal at the Germans from behind the Béarn. His head was sticking up just long enough for a sniper to get him. Shames then used a mortar with no base plate to fire blindly at the Germans, hoping to keep them off the bridge while De Carlo got back. The men at the road bridge were mainly H Company. G and I Company were at the footbridge, out of sight round the bend in the canal. Ken Christensen made several attempts to cross the Béarn to make contact with the other bridge. Jack Agnew, one of the Filthy 13, then blew a gap in the Béarn to make it easier to pass. As stragglers arrived, they were questioned about what they'd seen and who they had met. There was still no news of Colonel Wolverton or the 81mm mortar team. A Lieutenant Rudy Bolt arrived. He'd been concussed by a shell from the USS Nevada, and he wasn't in good shape. Shettle told him to go and dig in somewhere to recover. Later in the evening, Shames went to see him. Bolt was crouched in his hold, incapable of moving. Some men scouting around brought back some Ost Battalion prisoners. They were put in a barn at the aid station at Fortin Farm. During the night, the Germans east of the canal started firing and advancing. Ed was throwing fused C2 over the Béarn, while Sergeant Bennett fired the mortar. The Germans pulled back. Early on the 7th, C-47s came over dropping bundles just north of Fortin Farm, with food, ammunition and medical supplies. During the morning, some P-51 Mustangs attacked the footbridge, making it unusable. One of the planes went into a spin and hit its own bomb. Later, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts came across Fortin Farm, dropping bombs on the road bridge. Shames had jumped into a foxhole with Chaplain McGee. The planes disappeared, but came back firing cannons. Ed jumped out and started pumping off smoke shells. Pilots realised he'd made a mistake and broke off the attack. Only one man was killed in the attack. The sandy soil had allowed the men to dig deep foxholes. Captain Shettle sent Lieutenant Sandy to take a group to try and contact Colonel Sink, the regimental commander. At the same time, Christensen had taken some German paratroopers prisoner near Fortin Farm. They were put in a barn with the other prisoners. Shortly afterwards, the 88mm at Brevands opened up on the barn. Dozens of the POWs were torn to shreds. The farmer's wife, Odette Fortin, was in the yard, as was an 8-year-old girl, Georgette Reve. They were both killed. A runner came from the 501st informing Shettle that 260 German paratroopers were being brought to Fortin Farm. This was the result of the Hell's Corner ambush, where the outnumbered force of Johnson had bluffed the Germans into surrendering. By midday on the 8th, Colonel Sink had moved his command post to Longues. Following this link-up, a bombing raid was organised and the 88mm gun at Brevands. The wounded at Fortin Farm had been evacuated in jeeps by the 326th Airborne Medical Company. In the afternoon of the 8th, Colonel Cinq entered Saint-Côme-du-Mont. The 3rd Battalion was being relieved by the 327th Glider Regiment, who had come in landing craft onto Utah Beach. H Company moved to an orchard at Saint-Côme-du-Mont, while G and I Company moved to bivouac at Beaumont Farm near Cinque's command post. Shettle and Shames led HQ Company to the Folleville farm on the outskirts of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Head had a room in the main house. There was an Aga stove. He curled up near it and went into a deep sleep. It wasn't till the next day that he heard what happened to Colonel Wolverton. His body had been found still hanging from the risers in an apple tree. He had landed right in a German bivouac, and the Germans had used him as a target practice. News of the death of others kept coming in. Captain Hardwick had been missing since D-Day. He had been isolated and on the run from the Germans. He was given command of the 3rd Battalion and began replacing the missing officers. The 6th German Parachute Regiment had been holding Carentan. They pulled out on the 11th after 3 days of incessant attacks by Lieutenant Colonel Cole along the Purple Heart Lane. The 2nd Battalion went in on the 12th, more or less as shown in the Band of Brothers. The 6th Regiment had just moved to the southwest and had been joined by the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Ultra intercepts told the Allies that the Germans were planning a counterattack on the 13th of June. The 3rd Battalion was to be sent in to form the line of resistance to counter the counterattack. They were in the church square of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, waiting to get into trucks. Someone tapped Ed on the shoulder and said, "Happy birthday." It was Joe Madonna, who had landed in the 82nd zone. He learned that Jim Jaffert had been in the plane that crashed near Pointe du Hoc, leaving just 3 survivors. 2 ended up with the Rangers. The battalion was dropped off just north of Carentan and finished the journey on foot. A rare German bomber dropped a bomb on the group, but no one was hurt. There was an officers' meeting with Colonel Cinq. They were going to be attacked by 2 regiments of the 17th SS and tanks of the 6th Panzer Division. The 2nd US Armoured Division was still being offloaded on Omaha Beach. It was hoped they would arrive before the battle started. They did have 9 light Stuart tanks. They were also told there would be no extra ammunition. Some company commanders set out to establish contact with the 1st Battalion. A motorcycle dispatch rider was coming past slowly. He was stopped and asked where the 1st Battalion was. Then they realised he was a German. Doughty took him to Carentan, and they never found the 1st Battalion. Bloody Gully or Bloody Gulch, depending on which battalion you're in, went from Méotis Cross to the Carentan-Perrier Railway. Easy Company, or the Band of Brothers, were up against the railway line, then D and F companies. The other side of the Orvers Road was the 3rd Battalion. The land rose from the gully towards the German positions, giving them the advantage. Ed Shames had a radio operator with him, and he was to keep tabs on the 2nd Battalion on their right, the other side of the road. The 101st attack was to start at daybreak. A little detail complicated the whole plan. The Germans started their attack at the same time. Corporal Bobby Rommel, no relation, set up a machine gun 200 yards forward to cover the advance of H Company. Some Stuart tanks came up the road and mistook them for Germans and started firing the machine gun. Fortunately, the lack of ammunition meant they didn't fire for long, but a couple of men were hit. Shames couldn't see any 2nd Battalion men. F Company had been induced to retreat after coming up against self-propelled guns. D Company, with its right flank exposed, followed. Only Easy Company was left in the line. Later, a Stug, armed with a 75mm gun, came down the road from Donville. 3 Stuarts were going up the road, but they couldn't see the Stug due to the bend. Ed was running alongside, using them as shelter. Suddenly a shell went through the first tank and into the second. The third tank reversed, and Ed ran back to his radio. The Germans tried to take advantage of the situation by moving a machine gun to the position of the burning tanks. Shames got on the radio to report to Sink that there were no 2nd Battalion men to their right. After sending Colonel Chase to check on the situation, Sink decided to send in the 502nd, anti-tank guns and air support. Advancing was difficult for all companies. The lack of ammunition meant they were reluctant to use the mortars. Bill Galbraith broke cover and dashed forward towards where Jim Brown had set up a machine gun. When he arrived, he saw Ken Christensen and Leo Lecuyer from H Company were wounded. Both men had been shot by machine guns some 250 yards away across the field. As Jim Brown engaged the enemy gun, Galbraith moved along the hedge to see if he could help the wounded. Christensen had been hit in the shoulder and Lecuyer was badly wounded. Galbraith was trying to tend to Lecuyer when Lecuyer was shot and killed. Galbraith now patched up Christensen, who could now crawl back to the sunken lane. Shettle sent an observer up to high ground behind them to direct an artillery barrage. No barrage came, so Lujan and Stedman had to use their mortar. They didn't have enough mortar bombs to support a counterattack, but did manage to silence the enemy machine guns. Shettle did organise a counterattack by a group of men from G and I Company. He sent 2 men forward with a machine gun to give covering fire. Nothing was heard from them for some time, so Goodgal was sent to find them. He was one of the paratroopers that had been at Pointe du Hoc. When he found the 2 men with the machine gun, they weren't doing anything. They said they couldn't hear any firing, so they were just waiting. When the counterattack by 50 men was launched, they were forced back again. At 10:30, several Shermans arrived near Les Six Chemins and forced the Germans to pull out. By 11:30, most of I Company was back in the gully. There were wounded men everywhere. By mid-afternoon, after 11 hours of fighting, 1st Battalion 502 arrived with more tanks of the 2nd Armoured. 3rd Battalion was ordered to withdraw. In 2019, I gave a tour to someone whose uncle had been killed in this battle. He had been in the same Company G as the famous Pee Wee Martin. He had met Pee Wee Martin, who had explained that he had been just 5 yards from his uncle when he was killed, and he described the site relative to the gully and the hedge. It was just here. Colonel Sink had moved his command post to Carentan, near the port. In the evening he asked Shames to go and see him. He was impressed by his action during the Battle of the Bloody Gully, and he wanted to offer him a battlefield commission. So he was now 2nd Lieutenant. But they'd have to wait till they got back to England before the paperwork could be finished. Shettle had also recommended him and Chaplain McGee for their actions during the air attack at the bridges. They were going to get the DSC, Distinguished Service Cross. On the 14th, the 502nd pushed southwest, and by 1600 hours they joined up with the 82nd Airborne at Bourpt. In Carentan, men were queuing to get their hair cut in the reopened barber shops. The 101st was now at rest a few weeks till they went back to England to prepare for Operation Market Garden. On their return to Ramsbury, the whole village turned out to greet them.